The guard stepped into the center of the doorway at 9:18 a.m., and he did it the way people do when they have decided the answer before the question has been asked. She was standing in the third-floor corridor of the Caldwell Ossey Institute for Biomedical Sciences, a 17-year-old in a dark green quilted coat, a canvas tote on one shoulder, her hair pulled back with a plain elastic. She was holding a visitor's check-in slip from the lobby desk 3 floors below. She had filled it out in her own handwriting. She had printed her name in the box that said, "Name," and she had written the words "Grant Review" in the box that said, "Purpose of visit," and she had signed the bottom line with the same pen she used to sign the documents that had changed the direction of this building's entire research budget 14 months ago. None of that was visible from where Marcus Webb was standing. What was visible was a teenager, a black teenager in a quilted coat carrying a canvas bag, reaching for a door she had not been given a card to open. He said, "This floor is restricted," she said. "I know, I have a check-in slip." He said, "Doesn't matter. Restricted means staff and credentialed researchers only. I'm going to need you to step back." She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She stood exactly where she was, her hands still extended toward the door panel, and she looked at him with a stillness that should have told him something. It did not tell him anything. What did she say when the assistant finally pulled up the donor database on her screen and turned it toward Marcus Webb? Before we get to that moment, we need to go back. We need to go back 14 months to a different building, a different door, and a different kind of opening. The reading glasses were in her coat pocket. They had been in her coat pocket since the morning of the funeral. Wireframes, small oval lenses, one temple held straight with a strip of beige medical tape that Nana Ruth had applied herself because she said the optometrist wanted $40 to fix something a roll of tape could fix for free. Imani Caldwell had slipped them from the nightstand table 2 days after the burial, before the relatives arrived to help with the house, before anything was boxed or given away. She had not asked permission. She had not explained herself to anyone. She put them in her coat pocket, and she left them there, and in the 14 months since, she had reached for them 40 or 50 times not to wear them, just to feel the cold wire under her fingers and remember. Nana Ruth Caldwell had read everything. That was the only word for it. Everything. She had grown up in a mill town in North Carolina where the school for black children closed in February when the heating fuel ran out, and so she had taught herself to read with a Bible and a mail-order catalogue and a second-hand almanac that was 3 years out of date by the time it reached her. She had read her way out of that town by 18, worked her way through a 2-year secretarial certificate program by 22, and spent the next 4 decades as an administrative coordinator for a series of county health departments, reading every report, every study, every grant application that crossed her desk, understanding more of their contents than the people who wrote them. She never had a degree. She had something better. She had the habit of going to the source, reading it yourself and deciding what it meant with your own mind. "The library will never close on you," she told Imani once. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the small house in West Baltimore that smelled like cedar and coconut oil, and Imani was 9 years old, and she had dragged home a library book on plant cell biology that was 3 grades above her reading level. Nana Ruth had read the first chapter alongside her. "People will close doors," she said. "Institutions will close doors. A book just sits there and waits for you to open it. That is a kind of loyalty that almost nothing else offers." Imani had taken that literally. She'd taken it the way a child with a particular kind of mind takes everything, as instruction rather than decoration. By the time she was 11, she had read her way through the children's science section of the Enoch Pratt Library branch on North Avenue and had begun working through the adult non-fiction stacks, pulling anything with a diagram on the cover. The librarians knew her. The one who worked Saturday mornings, a soft-voiced woman named Mrs. Hargrove, had started setting books aside for her on a shelf behind the reference desk, things that had come in on donation or interlibrary loan, things she thought a child who read adult biology texts might find useful. Imani always returned them promptly. She dog-eared nothing. She treated every borrowed book as borrowed in the truest sense of the word, something that belonged to a larger conversation she was only one participant in. By 13, she had found the journal database the library subscribed to and was printing articles on molecular biology and reading them with a medical dictionary open on the table beside her, decoding them sentence by sentence. The process was slow. A single paper sometimes took 3 afternoons. She kept a composition notebook where she wrote down every term she had to look up, with its definition and a note about the context in which she had found it. The notebook had a water stain on the lower right corner of the cover from a cup of tea she had set too close to the table edge one January afternoon, and she kept it for 2 years until it was full, and then she started a second one in the same manner. By 15, she had begun emailing researchers whose work she had read, asking specific questions about their methodology, not introducing herself, not explaining who she was, just asking the questions the papers left unanswered. She wrote the emails in the library, at the computer terminal by the window, and she thought carefully about the wording before she sent them, making sure the question was precise, making sure it showed she had read the paper and understood it, rather than merely skimmed it. 3 of them had written back. 2 had sent her additional reading. 1 had told her, with evident surprise, that her question was the exact question his lab had been trying to answer for 2 years. She did not tell any of them she was 15. She did not tell them she was in the 10th grade. She asked her questions and she read their answers, and she went back to the library the next morning. Nana Ruth had watched all of this with a particular quality of attention, quiet and steady, like sunlight that does not announce itself. She did not praise Imani's effort the way some adults praised it, with an exclamation that made the child feel observed rather than seen. She asked questions. What did the paper argue? What did it not prove? What would you need to know next? And Imani would answer, sometimes stumbling, sometimes surprising herself with what she actually understood. And Nana Ruth would nod and say, "Good, go back to it." The last time they sat at the kitchen table together and talked about science was a Thursday evening in October, 6 weeks before the hospital. Imani had been reading a study on targeted drug delivery in pediatric cancer treatment, and she had a question about the ethics of the trial design, and Nana Ruth had listened to the full explanation, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Then she said, "The question you are really asking is about whose children get to be in the study, and whose children the study gets designed around." Imani had looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly the question." Nana Ruth said, "Then that's the work. That is the actual work." She set the mug down on the table. The condensation ring it left on the wood was faint and circular. "Somebody has to be in those rooms asking that question. Might as well be someone who spent enough time at the library to know what they're talking about." Nana Ruth died on a Tuesday in November, 14 months before Marcus Webb blocked a door on the 3rd floor of a building that carried her family's name. Congestive heart failure. She was 73 years old. She had read a scientific paper about cardiac tissue regeneration 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital, and she had called Imani to discuss it, and Imani had told her the study was promising, but that the sample size was too small to draw conclusions, and Nana Ruth had laughed and said, "That's what I thought, but I wanted to hear you say it." The grief had not arrived in a wave. It had arrived in increments, in small moments, each one more specifically painful than the last. The first time Imani found an article she wanted to share and reached for her phone to call before she remembered. The first time she read something confusing and wanted the specific comfort of reading it aloud to someone who would sit quietly and listen and ask the right question afterward. The glasses in her pocket were the only physical fact of that grief she could carry quietly, without explaining it to anyone, without needing to. Now, let me take you back to where the money came from. Imani's mother, Dr. Sandra Caldwell, was the executive director of the Caldwell OC Family Foundation, a private philanthropic organization that had been established by Imani's maternal grandfather, James Caldwell, after he sold his Baltimore-based logistics company in 2004. The foundation's primary focus was biomedical research access for underserved communities, and it operated with a board of 7 trustees, a small professional staff, and an endowment that had grown to just over $40 million by the time Imani was in middle school. Sandra Caldwell ran it with a methodical precision that her daughter had inherited and her colleagues respected, and she had been building toward a particular grant cycle for 3 years. The Caldwell Ozy Institute for Biomedical Sciences was a new building. The plaque on the lobby wall said it had opened 18 months ago, and the grant that funded the 3rd floor laboratory wing, the molecular diagnostics wing, had come from the Caldwell OC Family Foundation, $2,300,000. The naming rights for the floor had been part of the gift agreement. The floor was called the Ruth Caldwell Research Corridor. It had been named by Sandra for her mother. For Nana Ruth, who had never taken a formal science course in her life and who had read her way through a hospital's worth of medical literature from a chair in a Baltimore branch library. The building itself was 4 stories of glass and poured concrete, situated on the edge of a university medical campus that had been expanding into the surrounding neighborhood for 2 decades. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk with 2 guards and a visitor registration terminal, and the walls on either side of the elevator bank displayed framed photographs of researchers at work, pipettes and centrifuges, and gel electrophoresis setups, images that communicated seriousness and precision and the steady grinding work of scientific inquiry. The 3rd-floor elevator opened onto a corridor with pale wood paneling and institutional carpet, and the kind of overhead lighting that was designed to be adequate rather than warm. The east end of the corridor, past Laboratory 301, was where the naming plaque was mounted, beside a glass display case containing a brief description of the grant and its purposes, with a photograph of the Caldwell-Osei Foundation board taken at the grant signing ceremony. Sandra was in that photograph. Imani was not. She had been there that day, but she had stepped out of the frame when the photographer positioned the group, and nobody had asked her to step back in. Imani had been part of every conversation about that grant. She had sat at the dining room table with her mother on at least a dozen evenings, while Sandra walked through the proposal documents, and Imani had read the sections on research priorities because she was genuinely interested in the science, not because she was being useful. She had asked questions that sharpened 2 of the proposal's arguments, including a question about whether the proposed centrifuge procurement plan accounted for the calibration requirements listed in the molecular diagnostics protocol, a question Sandra had taken back to the facility's consultant, and which had resulted in a revision of the equipment budget. Her name appeared nowhere on the grant documentation. She was 16 when it was finalised. She had not asked for credit. She had asked for the papers to read. The grant review visit had been scheduled for 2 weeks. Imani was accompanying her mother as a Foundation observer, a formal designation that entitled her to access every space covered by the grant agreement. Her mother was in a meeting on the 4th floor where the administrative offices were. Imani had arrived at the 3rd floor 12 minutes early, check-in slip in hand, to review the equipment inventory before the formal walkthrough began at 10 o'clock. Marcus Webb had worked building security for 11 years. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had been given a rule, restricted floor, staff and credentialed researchers only, and who had been given no further instruction about the category of person who might arrive with a check-in slip and a canvas bag and a face that did not look to him like the face of someone who belonged here. He had made this same assessment before in this building, and it had always turned out to be correct as far as he knew because the person had always turned around and left. He had not yet been confronted with a case in which he was wrong. At 9:22 a.m., he told her a second time to step back from the door. She said, "My name is Imani Caldwell. I'm here as a Foundation observer for the Caldwell-Osei Grant Review. My mother is Sandra Caldwell. She's in the director's suite on the 4th floor right now." He looked at the name on her check-in slip. He looked at her face. He said, "I'm going to need to see credentials. Student ID doesn't count for this floor." Her jaw did not tighten. Her hands did not shake. One hand was in her coat pocket, her fingers resting against the wire frame of a pair of glasses, with one temple held straight by a strip of beige tape, and she breathed once, slowly, and kept her eyes on his face. "The lobby desk issued me this slip," she said. "It has a timestamp. It has a floor designation. It says 3rd floor, grant review, 9:15 a.m. "I understand that," Webb said. "The lobby desk doesn't override building access protocols. This floor requires authorization from the floor director or above. Do you have a letter from the floor director?" She did not have a letter from the floor director. Her mother had the formal authorization documents upstairs. This had not seemed like a gap that needed filling, because it had not occurred to anyone when planning the visit that a girl in a green coat with a signed check-in slip would need to prove something to a door she had effectively purchased. At 9:24 a.m., a graduate student named Ania Cole came through the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, carrying a thermal mug and a binder with colour-coded tabs. Ania was in her 2nd year of a biochemistry doctoral program, and she had been on the 3rd floor since 7 in the morning. She recognised Imani's face because she had seen the family photographs in the dean's office, and because the name on the corridor wall outside the East Lab entrance said Ruth Caldwell Research Corridor in sans serif bronze lettering, and she had asked about it once and been told the story. Ania walked the length of the corridor and stopped 3 feet from where Imani was standing. She said quietly, What's happening? Imani said, He won't let me through. Anya looked at Marcus Webb. She said, She's with the foundation. She's a grant observer. Webb said, I need authorization from the floor director or above. That's the protocol. Anya was 26 years old. She had a teaching assistant stipend and a shared office with 4 other graduate students and a thesis committee that met quarterly to tell her how much more work she needed to do. She was not a person with institutional power. She was a person with information, which is a different thing and sometimes a more useful one. She said to Imani, Come with me. My office is on this floor. You can wait there while I call Dr. Okafor. Webb stepped forward. He said, She can't access this floor without authorization. Anya looked at him steadily. She said, I am authorizing her. I am a registered researcher on this floor and I am extending a guest authorization. That is also in the protocol. She had, in fact, read the protocol. She had read it because she was the kind of person who read things, and she had recognized in Imani a younger version of the same instinct, and she was not willing to stand in the corridor and watch the protocol be used as a wall when it was written to be a door. Webb let them pass. He did it slowly, with the particular slowness of someone filing a note in their head about what they intended to do next. The small office smelled like coffee and dry erase marker. Anya cleared a stack of journals off the second chair and Imani sat down. The canvas tote went on the floor between her feet. She pulled the tote open and took out a cream-coloured folder, and Ania, who was dialing the phone on the desk, glanced at the folder and went still for a moment. On the front of the folder, in small printed letters, Caldwell Osai Family Foundation. Grant Cycle 7. Site Review, Ruth Caldwell Research Corridor. Anaya finished dialing. She said into the phone, Dr. Okafor, I'm sorry to pull you early. There's a situation on 3 you need to come down for. What she said next was quiet, and Imani was looking out the single window at the grey February sky and turning the glasses over in her pocket, and the click of the magnetic door lock in the corridor outside came back to her now, that flat, definitive sound. And she thought of Nana Ruth, sitting at the kitchen table reading something she had no formal right to understand, reading it anyway, reading it all the way through. Dr. Serena Okafor arrived at 9:41 a.m. She was the floor director, 44 years old, originally from Lagos, with a manner that was precise and unhurried in equal measure. She came through the door with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a tablet in one hand, and she looked at Imani and said, without preamble, Miss Caldwell, I'm deeply sorry. What happened in this corridor will be addressed today. Imani said, I only want to do the walk-through. Dr. Okafor said, You'll do the walkthrough and I am going to make a phone call first. She looked at the folder on the desk. She said, Is your mother aware of what happened? Imani said, Not yet. Dr. Okafor said, She will be in 5 minutes. She picked up the desk phone and Imani watched her dial 4 digits, an internal extension, and then listened to the brief, precise sentences that followed. Her voice did not rise. It carried the particular weight of someone who had decided to let facts do the work. When she hung up, she said, The Dean is sending a message to the full 3rd floor faculty. The formal grant review walkthrough will begin at 10 o'clock as planned with the Foundation Observer. That is you. We will do it correctly. At 9:58 a.m., Imani stood in the corridor outside the East Lab entrance. The bronze lettering was at eye level, 6 inches from her face. Ruth Caldwell Research Corridor. The sans serif letters were clean and square, and they did not ask for anything. They simply said the name. She reached into her pocket and wrapped her hand around the glasses and held them there for a moment. Not gripping, just holding. The door opened from the inside. Professor Hugh Stanton was the lead faculty researcher on the 3rd floor, 51 years old, with a publication record that the Institute used in its accreditation materials. He had been told, in Dr. Okafor's message, that a Foundation observer was arriving for the grant review, and he had assumed, without examining the assumption, that he would be greeting Sandra Caldwell. He came through the door with a prepared expression, a professional smile, a hand extended. He stopped. He looked at Imani. He looked at the folder under her arm. He looked at the corridor lettering behind her. He said, Miss Caldwell. She said, Yes, I'm the Foundation observer for the site review. I'd like to begin with the equipment inventory for laboratories, 301 through 306, if you're ready. He was not ready. That was visible. He was recalibrating, working through a gap between what he had expected and what was standing in front of him. A 17-year-old girl in a quilted coat with a grant review folder and a name that was on the wall of his corridor. He had the decency to let the recalibration happen quickly. He said, "Of course, come in." Inside the first laboratory, under fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency just below hearing, Imani opened the folder and began working through the inventory checklist. She named equipment by its catalogue designation. She cross-referenced maintenance logs. She moved from station to station with the methodical attention of someone who had read about this equipment before seeing it, who knew what a properly maintained centrifuge rotor looked like in a service log, and what a neglected one looked like by contrast. She asked about a centrifuge in the far corner whose service record showed a calibration gap of 7 months. She turned the log toward Professor Stanton and pointed to the date column without saying anything first. He studied the dates. He looked at her. He said, with genuine surprise, "You read equipment service logs?" "The grant agreement specifies calibration cycles," she said. "Quarterly for centrifuges. This one missed a cycle." She wrote a note in the folder margin. She did not explain herself further. He watched her move to the next station, the biosafety cabinet, where she opened the maintenance binder clipped to the door bracket and checked the certification dates. She found nothing wrong. She moved on. In the second laboratory, she found a discrepancy in the reagent storage temperature records, a 4-day gap in February where the monitoring log showed no entries which could indicate a logging error or a monitoring equipment failure. She noted it with 2 lines. She asked Stanton who was responsible for the storage records. He told her the name of a postdoctoral researcher who was currently on leave. She noted that as well. Something shifted in his expression, a small, quiet movement, like a door that has always been slightly off its hinges being lifted back into place. He said, "Your foundation funded this corridor." "My family's foundation," she said. "Yes. And you were involved in the grant proposal." "I was present for the conversations," she said. "I read the science. My mother wrote the proposal." He was quiet for a moment. They were standing between 2 lab benches, and the overhead light was steady and flat. And outside the door, the corridor was quiet except for the occasional sound of a fire door opening and closing at the stairwell end. He said, "We named this corridor for your grandmother." "Yes," she said. She would have liked the centrifuges. She had a thing about equipment being properly maintained. It was the first time she had smiled since she left the lobby, and it was small, private, already fading by the time Stanton noticed it. He noticed it. He looked at the folder in her hands, and then at her face, and then at the door leading back to the corridor where the bronze lettering was, and something in the geometry of those 3 things seemed to settle into a shape he had not expected this morning and was not going to forget. They continued through the inventory. 4 more laboratories, 2 more items flagged. At 10:47 a.m., in the corridor outside Laboratory 304, Sandra Caldwell arrived from the 4th floor with Dr. Okafor beside her. Sandra was 50 years old, wearing a charcoal blazer and a face that was composed in the way a face is composed when composure has required recent effort. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the folder open in Imani's hands. She looked at Professor Stanton, who had been walking beside Imani for 40 minutes, and whose expression had travelled a considerable distance from where it had started. Sandra said to Imani quietly, "Are you all right?" Imani said, "I'm fine. We're on Lab 304. Stanton flagged a supply storage discrepancy I want to look at before we close the inventory." Sandra stood still for a moment. 14 months of grief moved through her face, like weather moving through a clear sky. She said, "All right." Dr. Okafor said to no one in particular, "Let's continue." The supply storage discrepancy turned out to be a purchasing error, not a misuse issue, and Imani noted it with a single line and closed the folder at 11:23 a.m. The inventory was complete. The corridor was quiet. The bronze lettering caught the overhead light and held it. Professor Stanton addressed Sandra formally, standing in the centre of the corridor with Dr. Okafor and Ania Cole and 2 junior faculty members present, and said that the walkthrough had been conducted with thoroughness and rigour, and that the Foundation observer had identified 2 compliance items that the floor team had missed. He said the corridor was functioning as intended. He said they were grateful for the Foundation's investment. He said all of this looking partly at Sandra and partly at Imani, with the particular attention of someone who has recently updated a significant assumption about the world. Then he said to Imani directly, If you have any further questions about our research program, I would welcome the conversation. She said, I'll have a list of questions after I read the quarterly reports. He said, I'll send them to your mother. She said, you can send them to me. There was a pause. He said, I don't have your contact information. She reached into the tote and removed a business card. It was printed on heavy cream stock, small and clean. It said, Imani Caldwell, Research Associate, Caldwell OSI Family Foundation, and it had an email address. She held it out and he took it and looked at it for a moment before putting it in his jacket pocket. Ania Cole was standing near the East Lab entrance, and she caught Imani's eye and gave a small nod, the private acknowledgement between two people who have been on the same side of something. The walkthrough was over. The building would process it the way buildings process things, in memos and meeting notes and revised access protocols. The formal report would land on the dean's desk within 5 business days and would note, in measured institutional language, that a Foundation observer had been improperly blocked from a grant-funded floor at 9:18 in the morning of a site review day, and that the incident had been resolved prior to the formal review commencement. What the report would not capture was the 6 years of library tables and printed journal articles and late-night email exchanges with researchers who did not know how old she was. What it would not capture was the kitchen table in West Baltimore and the almanac, 3 years out of date, and the voice that said, "The library will never close on you." What it would not capture was the weight of wireframes in a coat pocket, carried for 14 months like a compass needle pointing toward a fixed and certain north. Marcus Webb was placed on a performance review the following morning. The review was not punitive in the theatrical sense, it was administrative and specific. It cited the gap in the access protocol training materials, which had failed to include Foundation observers in the authorized access categories, and it cited the incident as a training failure at the institutional level rather than placing the weight solely on one person. The training materials were updated. The update was distributed to all building security staff. The category of authorized visitor was expanded to include named Foundation representatives, regardless of age. The expanded protocol listed, as example number 1, grant-authorized Foundation observers, with a note that authorization could be verified through the donor database accessible from any security station in the building. The donor database had always been there. Nobody had ever needed to tell a guard to look at it before. Dr. Okafor sent Sandra Caldwell a formal letter of apology on institutional letterhead 3 days after the visit. It named the incident specifically, the time, the location, the nature of the refusal, and it named the corrective actions the Institute was taking, the access protocol revision, the updated training materials, the performance review. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It did not use the word unfortunate or the phrase we regret to inform. It used the word wrong once, in the 3rd paragraph, in a sentence that said, plainly, that what happened was wrong and should not have happened. Sandra forwarded it to Imani with no added message. Imani read it at the kitchen table in the house that still smelled like cedar and coconut oil on certain mornings when the light came in a particular way. She read it twice. Then she folded it in half and set it in the cream-coloured folder beside the completed inventory checklist and the compliance notes. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, something that did not have a single word for it, the specific quality of a thing being set right, not through someone's generosity, but through its own weight, through the plain fact of what was true and what was not. Ania Cole sent a text message the same afternoon the letter arrived. It said the updated access protocol goes live on Monday. Your name is in the system now. Imani wrote back that she was grateful Ania had not walked past. Ania sent back one word, obviously. 2 weeks after the walkthrough, Imani received an email from Professor Stanton. It contained 3 quarterly research reports as PDF attachments. The subject line said, "Per your request." She opened the first one at the library on North Avenue, at one of the long wooden tables near the window that let in afternoon light, the same branch where she had first found the journal database 4 years ago. The table was scratched and solid and smelled faintly of old paper, which was a smell she had loved her whole life. She sat for a moment before she opened the first document, just sitting, with the hum of the building around her and the soft sound of pages turning somewhere behind her. Then she opened it and began to read. She read for 2 hours. She took notes in a spiral notebook, the kind with the black and white marble cover, and she wrote 3 questions in the margin of the last page that she intended to send to Stanton before the end of the week. The questions were specific. They were the kind of questions that the papers themselves raised and did not answer. She had learned to read that way, in the space between what a paper claimed and what it had actually proven, looking for the gap, the open seam, the place where more work was needed and nobody had thought to look yet. At 4:30 in the afternoon, when the light through the window had gone low and amber, she put her pen down and reached into her coat pocket. The glasses were there. She took them out and set them on the table in front of her. The wire frames, the oval lenses, the beige tape on the right temple, and she looked at them for a moment, the way you look at something you have carried long enough that it has become part of your weight. The library was quiet around her. A few people at other tables. A child in the children's section 2 rows over, pulling a book from a low shelf with both hands. She picked the glasses up and slipped them back into her pocket. She closed the notebook and gathered her things. When she passed the reference desk on the way out, the librarian, who had worked that desk for 11 years and who recognized a regular reader when she saw one, looked up and said, "See you Thursday." Imani said, "Yes." She pushed through the front door and the February air came in cold and clean. And somewhere in the building behind her, on a shelf she had first touched at age 11, a book sat waiting that she had not yet had the time to read. She would get to it. There is something that does not show up in any grant report or access protocol revision or formal letter of apology. It does not show up in the bronze corridor lettering or the updated training materials or the business card in a professor's jacket pocket. What does not show up is the accumulation of a particular kind of knowledge, the kind that begins not in a classroom, but at a kitchen table with someone who read everything she could get her hands on and decided that the door the world closed could always be opened from the inside if you were willing to do the work. The biggest mistake is never being underestimated. It is believing the people who underestimate you. The girl who stood in that corridor on a Tuesday morning at 9:18 a.m. had not been taught to announce herself. She had been taught to know things. She had been taught that knowledge is the one asset that does not require anyone's permission to acquire, that a library card is a kind of skeleton key, that every door someone closes in front of you is a door you have the option of understanding from the hinge side. Hinge. She had been taught this not in any formal program or after-school enrichment class, but at a table in a small house in West Baltimore by a woman who had never had a seat at any institution and who had in the end had her name put on the wall of one. If there is someone in your life who carries that kind of knowledge quietly, without announcing it, without waiting for permission, pay attention to them. Not because they need your attention. They have been fine without it. The work of understanding what is actually in a room, what is actually possible, what has actually been built in silence by someone the institution forgot to ask, that work belongs to you too. The door is not locked from their side. It is only locked from yours. The quarterly reports landed in Stanton's inbox on a Friday afternoon. 3 questions, single paragraph each. All of them the kind of questions that force a researcher to go back to the data and look harder. He read them twice. He forwarded them to his graduate team with a single line of context. From the Foundation Observer, worth a full response. His graduate team spent 40 minutes trying to figure out who the Foundation Observer was before one of them, a third-year doctoral student, looked up the Caldwell-Ozai Foundation Board and found the organization's website and found the staff page and found, under Research Associates, a photograph of a 17-year-old in a dark green quilted coat. The questions were answered in full, all 3, within the week. Sandra Caldwell received the completed site review report on a Thursday. She read it at her desk, and then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk surface, looking at the window. Then she called her daughter and told her the compliance items had been formally logged and that the foundation would be scheduling a follow-up review in 6 months. Imani said, "I want to be there." Sandra said, "I know." 6 months later, on a morning in August when the corridor was warm and the bronze lettering caught sunlight from the east-facing window, Imani Caldwell walked through the third-floor door on her way to a follow-up review, and the door opened on the first try because her name was now in the system, in the authorized access category the protocol revision had created, listed beside her mother's name, which was listed beside the foundation's name, which was listed beside the grant amount, $2,300,000. Beside the corridor name, Ruth Caldwell Research Corridor, and the magnetic click of the lock was clean and certain and final, the way a door sounds when it is opening instead of closing. The same sound, but a different thing, entirely. In her coat pocket, the glasses were there.